welcome to Knitting 102. I want to start out, as I cast on here, talking about what's called knitting in the round. Now, in Knitting 101, we learned the basic knitting stitches, and we were always working in a manner that is called working flat. That means that we were creating flat pieces of fabric in mostly square shapes that, in order to create basically anything other than a scarf, would ultimately have to be sewn together. And for a long time, that's how it was done. And for some things, that's still how it is done. However, there is another way. And this way is called knitting in the round. The human body, you may have noticed, is basically a series of spheres and tubes. And so it makes sense, if we're creating things to wear, that those things are often shaped in spheres and tubes. Squares, however, and rectangles are obviously not spheres and tubes, and so they have to be sewn together to make those shapes, traditionally. But as I said, we also have a method called knitting in the round to create cylinders for certain kinds of knitted garments and accessories. This is a really helpful and efficient way to knit things because you eliminate the need to sew pieces of fabric together, which makes it faster to be finished, and also means that you don't have to also learn a whole lot about sewing if you don't already know it. Mastering some basic seaming skills is useful for your knitting. Not everything can be knit in the round. Some things do need to be sewn together, but this makes things a little easier in some cases. So some things are always or almost always knit in the round. Hats, mittens, and socks. Pullovers can be knit in the round. They can also still be seamed, and there are different reasons you might do one or the other, and the point of today is not to get into that, just to let you know. Cardigans, because they are flat, ultimately, are not usually knit in the round. That said, there is a method for knitting a cardigan in the round and then cutting it open. That is a much more advanced skill that, again, we will not be getting into today. Sweater sleeves for cardigans or pullovers may or may not be knit in the round. So let's start with the easy way. The easiest way to knit in the round is to use what this is, which is a circular needle. You can knit, and the great thing about circular needles that I mentioned in Knitting 101 is that you can knit both flat and in the round with them. So if you still have not filled out your knitting toolbox, I definitely recommend circular needles over straight needles because they can do both. You cannot knit in the round on straight needles, but you can knit flat and in the round on circular needles. Circular needles come in different circumferences. The smallest circumference is usually 16 inches. That's what this is. And that's going to be used for hats. There are some circular needles that come in 9-inch circumferences. I have not personally had success with them. Some people do, and you can use them for a smaller circumference. But most often you're going to see the smallest is here about 16 inches. And then they get larger. And circular needles also often come as an interchangeable needle set, which means that the tips, this part, can be removed, and you can change the length of the cable, this part, to make a larger circumference as needed. But we're going to start with just a basic, what is called a fixed circular, which means I cannot change the circumference. The circumference is 16 inches. And so normally you can see I've cast on lots and lots of stitches here. And if we were working flat, after casting on, what I would do is turn and start knitting this way. But we're going to work in the round, so I'm not going to turn. What I'm going to do is bring the opposite end of my cast on stitches to the opposite end of the needle. I am going to be very, very careful to make sure that what I'm going to call the butts of all my cast on stitches are facing inward. All need to be facing inward. So I'm going to make sure, and this isn't too hard when you're using a smaller circular needle for a project like a hat, but if you are knitting a pullover and you need to cast on like 200 stitches, you need to be really sure that all of those little stitch butts are facing inward. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a piece of fabric that's twisted in a kind of Mobius strip. So I'm going to make sure all my stitch butts are pointing inward. And then I'm going to take this doohickey. This, there we go, is a stitch marker. This is my preferred kind of stitch marker. These come in all shapes and sizes. It is basically, come on, focus in. It is basically just a little circular loop that you put on your needle. I like this kind that is kind of a piece of plastic that's slightly flexible because it doesn't get snagged on the yarn. A lot of kinds of metal circular needles, they're really cute and decorative, but they can get snagged on the yarn. So this is my preferred kind. And we're going to put that right here on our right hand needle. And then, as I said, instead of turning our work, I'm going to take my working yarn, the yarn that is connected to the ball, and I'm going to insert my right hand needle into my the first stitch I cast on, and I am going to start knitting this way. So instead of turning, I have simply joined the two ends of my cast on together by knitting the first stitch cast on with my working yarn, which was at the time still attached to the last stitch cast on. And I'm going to work around so that you can see what the join looks like. All right, I have worked all the way, almost all the way around. The way I know that is, here's my stitch marker. This marks the beginning of my round, and there it is. And here I'm about to knit the very last stitch that I cast on. There's my marker, so I slip it to the other needle, and now again I'm going to knit the very first stitch I cast on. All right, just work a couple of stitches so we can see. And that's the tail end of my yarn. I'm going to pull that tight, and here you go. You can see that the fabric is joined together now. No seaming, no sewing, just knitting directly from one end of the cast on to the other, joins the fabric together, and now it is a circle. As I said, not only is knitting in the round more efficient because you eliminate seaming, But many people enjoy knitting in the round because you don't have to purl in order to make a stockinette fabric. To make a stockinette fabric while working in the round, you knit every round, no purling. Some people don't have a problem with purling. Some people find it to be slower than the knit stitch, and they find it to be not as natural a hand movement. That's, entirely subjective. Personally, yes, I much prefer knitting to purling. I definitely find it faster. So I do enjoy using knitting in the round when possible. As I said, it's not always possible. You can't easily knit a cardigan in the round. And for some kinds of garments, you really need the seams to provide more structure. But for things like hats, sweater sleeves, socks, mittens, this is a really great technique that is going to make your knitting most likely go faster and be a little bit simpler because you don't have to worry about seaming pieces of fabric together. So what about when we need to knit something with a circumference smaller than 16 inches? That's where these guys come into play. Before the invention of circular needles, this is how pretty much all circular knitting was done, and it continues to be used today by many people, particularly for socks and perhaps sweater sleeves as well. These are double-pointed needles, usually called DPNs. And what that means is they're like straight needles, but they're usually shorter. And you can see both ends have a point. There's no stopper at the end. That means that you can slide the stitches from one needle to the other. And we want to do that because in order to create our smaller circle circumference, and it can be very tiny, we're going to arrange our needles in a kind of triangle, or some people will also do a square. And even though the needles are shaped like a triangle or a square, the actual fabric, as we knit from one needle to the next, forms a circle. This is fiddly. Okay, so it's not hard. You're not doing any knitting that's different, but learning to hold the needles and knit while holding the needles, particularly that very first round that you're going to knit, takes some practice. So, as I said, some people will make a triangle, some people will make a square. I make a triangle, which means I'm going to use 3 needles to hold my stitches and make my square, make my circle, and I'm going to use the 4th needle to knit. So the first thing you're going to do, the pattern will tell you to cast on such and such number of stitches and divide evenly. So that means I'm going to cast all of my stitches onto one needle and then spread them over the other stitches. So for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and cast on 18 stitches. So we have a nice evenly divisible by 3 number. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 6 more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, perhaps some people do. I do not, because I find it more trouble than it's worth. Just cast on, in this case, 6 stitches onto each needle. I find that more fiddly than it's worth. So I'm going to cast all of my stitches onto one needle, and then I'm going to slide them onto the other needle. So the first stitch cast on, the last stitch cast on. I'm going to slide these stitches to the opposite end of the needle, and then I'm just going to slip 6 stitches onto each of these other needles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You want to slip these stitches purlwise. That means you're going to insert the needle as if you were purling the stitch and just slip it over. And then I get my other needle, 6 to that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, and now I have my stitches divided evenly over my needles, and you can see here how the fabric is going to form a circle when I knit them together. So, as with the other kind of knitting in the round on the circular needle, I'm not going to turn my work and work backward. I'm going to join the last cast on stitch with the first cast on stitch. So, as I said, learning to hold all of these stitches, all of these needles and use them, it takes some practice. So what you want, again, make sure all your little stitch butts are pointing inward so it doesn't get a twist. The way I like to do this is to have the middle needle kind of hanging out under the other two. I personally find that makes it easier. Your mileage may vary on that one. So I'm going to basically hold all 3 of these needles in one hand, my left hand, and pick up the working needle with my right hand. I'm going to make sure I'm keeping the tail end of my yarn here out of the way. So I'm going to pull that kind of forward and out of the way. And here's my working yarn here. So I'm going to keep the middle and the last needle. Keep the stitches kind of in the middle, but I'm going to slide these stitches to the end. Okay, so as you can see, I'm kind of pinching all 3 needles between my index finger, my middle finger, and my thumb. And now I've got my other needle ready to work. So I'm going to insert this into the first stitch. Cast on a little tightly, so there we go. Now I'm going to just pull my working yarn around and knit while holding on to all of these needles. Now, once you get going, as long as you have enough stitches to kind of hold these needles in place, because they can be kind of slippery, and if you only have maybe 1 or 2 stitches on each needle, they could actually kind of slide out. But as long as that's not the case, you can kind of let them hang a little bit once you get going. So you can see I'm no longer holding that middle needle, and I'm not gripping the last needle either. I'm really only holding the first needle and my working needle, and the other 2 are kind of hanging back. So I'm going to knit all of the stitches from that first needle. The patterns will often number the needles so you know what they're talking about. All right, so I made it to the end of the first needle. I'm going to slide the stitches to the middle of it. I'm going to slide these stitches to the top. And here we go again. Knit across while holding all of my needles. You can see, this one's just kind of swinging around, but it's got enough stitches on it to keep it from sliding out. Just kind of maneuver my needles again until they're comfortable for me to hold, and it's going to take you some time to figure out what's comfortable for you. But as long as you're keeping them in the right order, it really doesn't matter how you choose to hold them. So again, I'm now at the last needle. I knit all the way to the end. Here's the last stitch I cast on, which is what I'm going to knit now. And now we've made one round, one circle. And then we just keep going. Just like using the circular needle, knitting in the round on DPNs. To make a stockinette fabric, you knit every stitch. You may find that your join isn't quite as smooth with the DPNs. That's something that you can fix when you're done your project and you're weaving in the tail end of your yarn. You can use that to kind of tighten up the join there. And that's it. Those are the two methods for knitting in the round. You can see the DPNs are able to create this very small circumference, just a couple of inches. There are ways to knit smaller circumferences without using the DPNs. I have a tutorial here on the YouTube channel on one of those methods that's called Magic Loop. You can check that out if you are ready to try something a little bit more advanced and you want to avoid having to use DPNs. But as I said, once you get the hang of it, it's a little bit fiddly, but it isn't difficult. And it is a very convenient way to make circumferences as small as you might need for your knitwear.